Okay, sorry for that delay, everyone. But we managed to all get back together in the same room, and now we can even see each other. So, please just stick up your hand if you have a question, and I will call on you. And yeah, let's take it away. Who has a question? Mateusz, go ahead.
Yeah, so I have a question. Do you, do you have in mind like any? So assume we succeed in doing some gradual um, gradual but massive conceptual revision. How can we tell whether we are moving in the right direction, other than just our thinking seems clearer on our like subjective sense?
That's a good question. I don't think I have a good answer. I mean, um, like I guess I like the analogy of like a big code refactor for a big, you know, computer programming project. Like how can you tell? Well, like it seems like things are going to be more elegant. It seems like you will be sort of more empowered to um, have like the things you want to do are sort of like readily implementable the um, using the pieces that you're constructing. Um, uh, I mean, like, I mean, the actual criterion is like, can you like give good arguments for like, alignment stuff? Like, um, I mean, we in alignment we do have like some actual like explicit, clear-ish problems, uh, like reflective stability and so on, um, that you should be able to clarify. Sorry, yeah, I'm not giving a very good answer. You could re-ask the question. Um,
Mateusz, would you like to follow up, or shall I?
I think that's enough. And yeah, thanks.
Okay. So while I wait for other hands to pop up, I'll just ask a follow-up question on Mateusz's question, which is, um, so to me, I was hearing a kind of it reminded me of this kind of classic debate in political philosophy between conservatives who think there's a kind of embodied wisdom in the institutions that exist and have built up over a long period of time, and a kind of wisdom that consciously we could never recreate from scratch in a new system, in a revolutionary order. And then there's kind of revolutionaries who say, look, if we just swept away all of this kind of nonsense that's accumulated over time, there would be this kind of utopian, better, they're thinking of institutions again, but we can think of the same thing for concepts. So is there a kind of case to be made for, well, is there a conservative case to be made here in that our concepts as a whole have kind of had this process of dealing with minds, in at least human minds, over thousands of years and kind of gradually refining themselves such that they can deal with various notions and failures and so on of understanding, and dealing with predicting at least human minds quite well with belief, desire, intention psychology, and so on. And maybe there's some kind of deeper wisdom in there, some kind of convergent abstractions, maybe. Um, does that appeal at all or not?
I mean, it sounds like it certainly seems like true to like some significant extent. Uh, uh, like, yeah, like we have concepts, whether whether they be explicit or implicit, like things we talk about or things we don't talk about. We have like ability to cope reasonably well with, um, yeah, like the range of situations and behavior that we actually encounter with ourselves and other people. Uh, I mean, one implication for this is like, yeah, like we might expect that investigating our pre-existing intuitive concepts, including inexplicit ones, about agency, humans, beliefs, goals, might have might produce value in the same way that if you went and investigated institutions that are highly functional, even if the institutions don't know how they are highly functional, you might investigate them, and you can figure out how they're highly functional. I mean, I think an analogy here would be like, okay, now we're going to like send a generation ship with 500 people to the nearest star, and we want them to not like tear each other apart. So we have to design an institution, and like this basically isn't analogous to anything. Like maybe like you can think about like people going on a sea voyage or something, but like it's still not analogous. Like they're not going to be like permanently cut off from humanity, except maybe communication, you know, for forever. Whatever. It's very disanalogous, and you're trying to like suddenly you're like trying to make a whole bunch of demands in a very new context where like your old familiarity with the situation may or may not break. Probably it will break. And this is even more so in the case of AGI, just because minds are big and complicated, and AGI will be extreme.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
so we
so
have.
yeah.
Oh, sorry, you have more to say.
No, let's proceed.
Okay. So the next question we have a hand up is Wojtja. Do I say that right? Probably not.
We can't hear you if you're talking.
We don't hear you right now. You're not muted, but we don't hear you.
Wojtja, we still can't hear you.
Chat says mic not working.
Okay, well, feel free to type your question, Wojtja. In the meantime, Matthias sort of wrote a follow-up to our exchange that maybe you deal with similar issues in this green spoons rule. So what's that on the hermeneutic net, your post there? So maybe you can explain that concept to us and if you think it's relevant here.
Well, so the rule is, I forget why it's relevant. The rule is that every programming language, or something like, if you're writing a big complicated program in a programming language that is not Lisp, you will end up making an ad hoc partial re-implementation of half of Lisp. So I forget why that's relevant.
My understanding of why that might be relevant is that so assuming that there is some like institution or social norm or whatever, and you don't understand like its kind of effective function in society, so you remove it, and it like spontaneously recreates itself, but in a form that's like much less functional than the one that you replaced. And so in a similar way, like you have if you try to remove some concept without understanding like the role that it's playing in your mind, or like in the theory or framework or a way of thinking, then it becomes like, and it ends up recreated, but it's like as half of common Lisp in a big programming project. It's slow, buggy, and well, not formally verifiable or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting.
So, Wojtja, have you managed to get your mic working or typing a message? No? Okay. Well, please do type out your message just so we can still get it from you. We have a question here from Kira. Do you distinguish concepts and abstractions?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I don't know what people mean by abstractions, but generally I have a somewhat negative reaction to talk about abstractions, although probably plausibly I'm misunderstanding. But okay, okay. What concepts to me are well, okay, so like one key difference between a concept and an abstraction. So, sorry, I may be misinterpreting what people mean by abstraction. When people say abstraction, what I hear is something like a high level feature, like a recognition. People also use the word concept this way, like a category. When I'm saying concept, I don't just mean category. Like I think it would be strange to like. I have a concept of a gear. I think it would be strange to talk about my concept of a gear as though like the main thing about it is that I use it to recognize what's a gear and what's not a gear. Like I also use my concept of gear to make gears. I also use my concept of gears to think about what happens if I mesh two gears with such and such sizes, and so on. Like concepts are like mental elements, chunks of mind, whatever, something, mental elements that you use for a bunch of things. One of them would be classification, another would be prediction, another would be design, another would be like, like directing action, like making a gear. Yeah. If I didn't address your question, please re-ask it. But yeah.
I'm seeing a nod from Kira, so you may have managed it, but feel free to follow up, Kira, if you're still have questions. Keep putting your hands up and asking questions. I'll ask another one for now. So particularly when you were talking about like thinking about interpreting minds through what's going on with particles, it was really sounding a bit like Dennett's idea of the physical stance, this idea that we can understand complex systems through their physical properties and the laws of nature and what they will behave like. We can, if we know enough about their physical natures, whatever the fundamental physical stuff is, maybe it's energy, maybe it's particles, whatever. And if we just combine that with the right laws of nature, we can just predict, like Laplace's demon, what things will do. And he points out, well, the advantage of that is there's no risk involved insofar as you can do it. Of course, the downside is you normally can't do it with complex systems. Now, he ends up talking about the intentional stance, interpreting things as agents, interpreting things as behaving rationally given beliefs and desires and goals. And he says this is a much more risky strategy because those assumptions could be false or they could be leaky in some kind of way. On the other hand, when they work, they grant you amazing predictive power over extremely complex physical systems. Do you think that this approach is similar to what you're laying out in terms of the trade-off? Or do you see the trade-off slightly differently to Dennett? So for Dennett, it's sort of a risk versus predictive power that you're trading off. Risk of building too many assumptions in versus predictive power.
So I read like some part or maybe all of some essay by Dennett about the intentional stance, and I still wasn't sure whether he was saying what you just summarized him as saying, but that your summary was my best guess, and I disagree with that position. Or like I sort of agree with it, but it feels like very importantly incomplete. In a similar way to Kira's question. First I want to make a side note, which is the thing that you described Dennett as saying would really apply to any model. Like any model is like an inductive bias, like you're trading off probability mass from different possible worlds, between different possible worlds. So you're always taking a risk or something. In that sense. But I basically don't think that what Dennett is, if I take Dennett to be, if I take intentional stance to to be ostensibly referring to whatever humans are doing when we are relating to something as an agent, as something with intentions, then similar to my answer to Kira's question, and also related to what I had said on an earlier slide about the particles thing, basically just there's other things that we are doing with the intentional stance other than just prediction. An example which feels like it's a little bit cheesy or something to say, but basically like something like I want my friends to have intentions or something. Like I have a value. I have various values. One of these values is friendship, and like a fortiori or something. My values involve the concept of intentions. Like I want to be friends with people, and people have intentions. And so like, yeah, or like, or like more generally, like moral patiency. Like if I say something like, I don't think I want to. I mean, moral patiency isn't the same thing as intentions, obviously, but like, just like if I say something has moral patiency, or if I say something is conscious, if I say something has intentions, I have values about those things. So I'm not just saying I predict such and such. And as yet another category, so there's prediction, there's values. As another category, there's how this directs my my actions. And predictions are relevant to directing actions, but there's other ways that things can be relevant to directing actions. Like my concept of gears tells me how to make a gear. Like it's not just a prediction. Yeah.
Right. So there's a lot more to this kind of what the functional role of these concepts are. That's not captured just in terms of the predictive power it grants you. Okay, we have a couple more questions in the chat now. So Voita has typed in her question now, so I'll just read it out for the sake of the recording. So a possible solution to the piecemeal thinking problem would be to not adjust your conceptual schema on the go, but to instead keep your old schema as it was and develop a new one in parallel. And this way, it's okay if the new schema is non-functional until it is fully complete. What's your take on this suggestion? Is it perhaps impossible because developing a new conceptual schema from scratch is too hard, or because this is too hard for a single person to do, and you need to do it collaboratively? Does that mean that your conceptual schema has to be functional all the way down during development? Yeah, so what do you think of this idea? How do you think it goes wrong?
Yeah, it's interesting. I hadn't thought about it. I mean, it does remind me of things where like someone might spend like a long amount of time, like months or years, sort of like hanging out with a crowd, but not like quote unquote identifying with it, and like playing with various ideas and words and arguments, but not like, but like saying that like they don't believe it or endorse it or whatever. And then eventually maybe they wander off or they like switch and they're like, yep, I believe all this stuff. What do I think? Well, yeah, I mean, it clearly solves like it clearly like potentially solves some problem, namely like, as you say, if you needed to use your conceptual scheme along the way, then you can just have both. Yeah, I think it's hard for humans to do this. I think there's a more fundamental problem maybe, which is like basically I mean, I'm just making this up right now and it's conjectural, but conjecturally I would expect that like this doesn't actually buy you very much because it's not that you need to use your conceptual scheme for some other stuff along the way. And you're like, oh no, I don't want to break my old one because I need to use it for other stuff other than my big investigation. The problem is the investigation itself has to involve a whole bunch of you using this conceptual scheme. Like sort of, for example, like if you're like trying on a bunch of concepts about minds, you're like, here's what I think a goal is, and here's what I think beliefs are, or whatever. Or like, here's like 5 different concepts of what beliefs are, and here's 6 different concepts of what goals are. And now I want to like learn how they interact with each other. You want all the feedback you can get. So for example, if you're getting feedback from observing human minds, like your mind and other human minds, you're like, here's a bunch of new hypotheses, like possible concepts that might be useful, that might be joint carving. I'm going to like watch human events. I'm going to watch my own thinking. I'm going to watch other people's thinking. I'm going to see how these new conjectural concepts line up with what I'm seeing in minds. Like this is just a whole bunch of activity that you're doing. This is like a whole bunch of, this is, first of all, this is like very good, and maybe something like this is necessary to get good concepts. You like have to use any data you can get. And second of all, it's just a bunch of activity that's very much in was playing. Like previously you were part of the previous conceptual scheme, and now the feedback you're trying to get with the new concepts is like how they do in this task. So basically I'm just saying it's not necessarily, you still basically have to be using the new concepts as you're coming up with them. I guess is basically what I'm saying.
Yeah, so Vojta says, right, so we can't design a good conceptual schema without getting some kind of mental feedback, which requires it to be at least somewhat functional. Does that sound like what you're saying?
Yeah, I think so, basically, yeah.
Or perhaps you could try to come up with many schemata and try them all, but that's not something a person can do. Too much compute.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, cool. Interesting question. So Kira asks, why doesn't the existence of doesn't the existence of a spectrum of minds in nature imply decomposability of components?
Not sure I understand. Doesn't the existence of a spectrum imply decomposability of components? Yeah, I'm not sure what decomposability of components means. Let's see.
Kira, would you like to explain with the mic, maybe?
Sure. Just but like there are like varying levels of complexity of mind, which would seem to me to suggest that minds are not a irreducible whole.
Oh, okay. You're sort of responding to like the inverse net claim.
Yeah.
Yeah, got it. Okay, sorry. Yeah, I think okay. So imply like decomposability into components. I think I was just confused by decomposability of components. Okay. Okay. Doesn't it? Yeah. Actually, yeah. Wait. Sorry. Why does the Sorry. Maybe you literally just said this, and I was not paying attention to that aspect. Can you either type or in the mic say
Oh.
a sentence or two about why does the existence of a spectrum of minds in nature imply decomposability of minds into components?
Oh, because there um there because evolution needs to like sequentially build up to more complex minds. So it should like be able to like, you should also be able to like reduce the complexity compositionally.
Okay. I mean, I think what I mean, it's a good question. I'm still struggling. Now I think I get what you're getting at more, but so like what I'm struggling with for as an example is like, where are the values in the genome or something? Like you can kind of say, we can look at like what were the values of like our worm ancestor, and then like what were the values of like the whatever it's called, tetrapod. You can like look at like a genealogy of humans and ask like what are the values of like the organisms of this species, and then you get like a sequence of values or something. And I'm kind of like, this just does not seem like you're getting at the concept of values. Like it doesn't seem joint carving for values. It feels similar to like, it just feels like the wrong level of abstraction. But that's not very compelling. Maybe.
Can I just jump in and ask? So just on this, so there are some people in sort of cognitive science who think that like there's a very sort of continuous story you can tell from animals to human cognition, and there's others who think some kind of significant step change happened, such that we are like concept laden minds, and they are not in the same way. So is there kind of room to say that sure, like the tools, sort of the mental or even the brain based modules or whatever, they all had to kind of build up over time and be kind of composable in this kind of step by step way. But the point at which the mind is reprogrammed according to like maybe linguistically based concepts, that's a kind of step change, or do you think that that's not the way to go?
There's clearly some step change, but I also would expect that, like, I would expect, for example, that it makes sense to talk about uplifting some animal species, like cows or octopi or whatever. Like, I would expect that it's like somewhat reasonably coherent-ish to talk about like tweaking some parameters that like, so you get something that's like pretty much a cow but with language, or pretty much an octopus but with language, and then like with language, the sort of like imaginal discs of like, sorry, a caterpillar has things called imaginal discs, which on a caterpillar don't look like anything, but then when the caterpillar goes into a cocoon and metamorphoses into a butterfly, the imaginal discs are the site from where the wings sprout. So I would think of like most animals, my guess is that most animals are sort of like, they don't have minds, but they have imaginal discs of minds, metaphorically speaking. Like they do have, like, to say it a different way, they sort of have the algorithm which in humans, many animals species would have the algorithms which in humans unfold into minds, but the animals do not themselves have minds. but sorry, I'm not sure. I'm still thinking about Kira's question.
I mean, maybe one of the cruxes is just where we stand on which animals have minds.
It's possible. I'm not actually sure why that would be a crux or decompose. Like, I mean, my guess is that the crux is sort of like what we're trying to get out of the concept of decomposability. Like, I sort of like perfectly well expect. I mean, we already like have. I'm sure you know more about this than I do, but and maybe you can tell us. But like, we already have like neurological experiments where you can like see the chunk of brain that's like active when you're thinking about elephants or whatever, and this is like different from the chunk of brain that's active when you're thinking about grandma and whatever. Like this is some amount of decomposability, and like there's other sorts of decomposability that we see in neural nets, I guess. I hear, but like, so if this is, so the potential crux here is like, how decomposable or something, and like in particular, like how much does it make sense to like or sorry, I'm not formulating my thoughts very well at the moment. I guess like, I mean, a starting point is just like I'm not satisfied with things in this genre or something. Like if you're like, when like I've identified like some stuff in the mind that is like a cluster that's active when the mind is thinking about X and not and it's not the case that and whenever the mind is not thinking about X, maybe a little bit of this cluster is active, but not most of it. So the mind is thinking about X if and only if most of this cluster is active or something. I'm just like, in general, not going to be satisfied with this sort of thing, because I'm like, this just doesn't tell me much of what I wanted to know. Like, how can I say this? I'm going to give it like an analogy. Suppose you're like, okay, I've understood this mind. I see that when it sees things, when it sees things that are about apples, these numbers in these registers change. When it sees stuff that are about elephants, these other numbers in these other registers change. So that's that. So the way it thinks about apples are in these registers, and the way it thinks about elephants are in those registers. And I'm like, no. Suppose that, like, imagine that what we're actually looking at is a Bayesian reasoner, and these registers changing their numbers upon seeing apples are like estimates of the probability that the thing that was in the box was an apple or an elephant. It's definitely relevant to how the mind is thinking about apples, what goes on in those registers. But you also need to know that it's a Bayesian reasoner. Like there's this other structure that's like active, that's like always active, or yeah, let's say it's always active, like the Bayesian update rule. So this thing is not at all visibly like related in a modular way to like apples in particular, but it's very important for understanding the significance of these registers changing the numbers that they're storing. That's hopefully at least like a hint of why I'm saying that modularity is not that I have some sort of high bar for modularity or something.
Cool, thanks. So
I guess I'm. Go ahead. Yeah.
Just we have quite a few follow-ups to this line of question, which I think are quite interesting. So maybe we can throw those into the mix and see if you want to say anything more about them. So in the chat we had, let's take Voitus first. So she raises that, so perhaps understanding a particular class of minds, such as ones obtained via evolution in our world, could be easier than understanding general minds, including AGI potentially, right? So is the thought here like, okay, maybe in some sense you can tell a kind of decompositional story or whatever in evolution that tells you something about how minds build up over time, but it's not going to be a great guide when you're thinking of the whole possibility space of mind, something like that? Or do you just, I mean, it sounds like we're not really buying this whole breaking it down approach to thinking about minds in the first place. So maybe you don't even need that move.
Perhaps understanding a particular class of minds, such as ones easier than understanding general minds. I mean, understand, yeah, the word understand is super vague here. I mean, like, I mean, if we go back to like your institutional analogy, or just like the idea of like humans are already familiar with humans, like we're familiar with being a human and we're familiar with interacting with other humans. Like, how can I say this? Like basically, what we will have sort of like a bunch of inductions that are correct for humans and incorrect for minds in general. I don't know whether you want to call this understanding. Like, I guess I would say like I would, in my native way of speaking of understanding, I guess I'm sort of implicitly like thinking of understanding as being like pretty explicit, or like even if it's not exactly explicit in the way that we intuitively talk about explicitness, it's at least like a good working counterfactual knowledge. Like a blacksmith has a lot of like working counterfactual knowledge about like what would happen if I hammered the thing this way or that way, or put this tool down and then hammered the hot metal on top of it, whatever. And so like even if the blacksmith doesn't like explicitly have this knowledge, I couldn't like write down a book, like just like sit down and write a book without like a bunch of extra explicitizing work. Even if a blacksmith doesn't have it explicitly, it's still what I would call understanding, in the sense that it's like the blacksmith's understanding of the metal and how it moves and responds is good or handy in that it can perform the tasks that the blacksmith wants to perform. And like, for example, being able to compute the counterfactuals correctly that the blacksmith wants to compute. So by that criterion of understanding, by that like level, by that criterion of understanding, I'm like, I think we don't understand human minds, and this familiarity that we have with human minds and human goals and values and beliefs and so on, this familiarity is not really understanding. Like we wouldn't, I mean, we get freaked out when people are like acting surprisingly sorry, what am I saying? I'm saying like we don't really understand extremes very well, and we don't understand counterfactuals very well for humans.
Yeah, so this sort of familiarity with human minds we might mistake for understanding, but it's not understanding in the sense that you really mean it here. Is that kind of along the right lines?
Yeah, I'm worried that I didn't respond to Wojciech's actual question, but
I think we made progress there. So Matthias is asking, so do we understand roughly in terms of develop a kind of joint carving theory of reality where we know sort of yeah, we have the concepts which really get to the nature of things in some kind of deep way? Is that involved in understanding?
definitely involved. I don't know if I want to say approximately equal. Develop a joint carving theory. I mean, one thing here is like what counts as a joint sort of like depends on what you're trying to do. Again, like, yeah. Um, um, and like, I feel like joint carving is sort of maybe overly, we're sort of like subtly we sort of like subtly are having this like correspondence theory of truth thing, which is good but not everything. Like I would say correspondence theory of truth is another ex-supremacist type thing, where like I mean, if you're doing math, it becomes harder to sort of talk about. It feels like it's harder to sort of say joint carving, or if it is joint carving something, it's sort of joint carving your own thinking. Like if you like, I think the analogy of joint carving literally comes from like a butcher carving up animals. And sorry for the gruesome analogy, but I think it's where it comes from. Like there is an actual animal there who actually has joints or something. Like at least once you understand, seems like a pretty natural abstraction, like a convergent way of thinking of the animal as a physical object, that it has joints. It's just like an object that has joints. It makes sense. But like if you invent the concept of a group, the mathematical concept of a group, what did you carve at the joints? I mean, you can maybe do it. You can maybe think of it this way, but it's a little weirder. It's more, maybe you could think of like a mental activity that you're carving at the joints.
Yeah, in the context of mathematics, I think it's more like when you invent the concept of a group, you realize that many other mathematical structures, including some that you find like kind of encoded in nature, actually can be fruitfully represented as groups, and like they can be modeled as groups, viewed as groups, and also that like this concept, in a way, adopting this concept, like adding it to your conceptual toolbox allows you to make like discover other mathematical concepts which was like better organize your thinking. And it like, so the best way you could say that a mathematical concept is joint carving without without referring to the physical to the physical world is that it allows you to like see mathematical order in like the broader mathematical structure that you didn't see before, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, I think, yeah, I think there's definitely something to this. I guess like one point I want to make here is sort of like we don't actually have to justify it this way. We probably can, and it's probably interesting, but we don't actually have to. We sort of already know that the concept of group constitutes understanding, and that's sort of my point. It's like, yes, joint carving is sort of like a key like constituent or consequence of what we call understanding, but it's not like the defining constituent. It's not like constitutive of understanding. It's like the concept of groups is like visibly good or useful or something in other ways. Like you can like do computations and proofs that you couldn't do before. And like, was it joint carving? Maybe it's interesting, but it doesn't determine whether it was useful.
Cool. I have a quick question, sort of moving topic slightly, but I kind of found myself thinking, is there any real alternative to the part by part change of conceptual schema? And because I mean, if you think about, I mean, there's views in philosophy like conceptual holism or conceptual role semantics, the idea that everything gets its meaning from everything else and how it's connected up. And from that perspective, each part, in order to kind of even think about something over here, it would have to be connected to where you're coming from. In other words, there's no view from nowhere. You're always using your concepts to think about other concepts. And so there's no escape in that sense. You're always kind of doing little movements within your conceptual schema. And it's hard to see what an alternative would even look like of this more radical, revolutionary kind of developing concepts. So maybe you can fill that in a little for me.
I'm a fairly ignorant man, so I didn't know about that. Can you say what is it called? Philosophical holism?
Yeah, so there's conceptual holism and semantic
Conceptual
holism, which is the linguistic version, and HOLISM. And there's also conceptual role semantics, which is one of the most developed versions of this within the linguistics. But people take it to talk about intentional thought in general. Yeah, Matthias has got a link to the Stanford Encyclopedia on it.
Yeah.
No, I don't know that
like,
much about this, but it just brought what you were saying brought this to mind for me.
Yeah, it sounds related. I guess, yeah, like mostly I'm just trying to point out the problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, what could you possibly do differently? Mateusz asked me yesterday he asked me, are there historical examples of this happening? And my answer was plausibly no, or if there are, I don't really know, but perhaps Heidegger would be one example. Like I sort of have weak evidence of this, where the evidence, like, this is pretty lame. Oh, bye, Wojciech. There's sort of like weak evidence, where the weak evidence is like when you read Heidegger, or when you read Being in Time, there's like a steady stream of new words, and the words. I mean, maybe you just think it's all BS. I feel like I got like some amount of significant insight, but also a lot of like not really getting what the point was, or not understanding, or maybe disagreeing. But anyway, so like, but leaving that aside, you sort of like get a steady stream of new words, and the stream of new words has the feature that like you get this feeling that like Heidegger is sort of like trying to say stuff, sort of like explain a new word. Really, he wants to explain the new word by saying a bunch of sentences that use a bunch of the other new words, most of which he hasn't introduced yet.
Yeah. Like Wittgenstein climbing his ladder and then throwing it away.
Exactly.
You don't know how you got there, but you're there.
Exactly. Yeah.
Sorry, Matthias, you had a hand on this too.
Yes, regarding conceptual holism, like I'm not that familiar with. I'm somewhat familiar with the idea, not like super familiar, but like it's definitely not the case that every concept is like literally strongly connected to every other concept. So like the thing that people often bring up, like as an argument for conceptual holism, is that imagine that in some person somebody like some neurosurgeon managed to implant an isolated memory in somebody else's brain. That a person who is the only child has implanted a memory that they have a brother which has such and such name and lives so and so, and then they talk to somebody and the person they're talking to asks them, "Do you have any siblings?" Yeah, I have a brother. His name is such and such. He lives there and there. And wait, and then they realize that, oh, actually, I don't have any memories associated with my brother. So they realize that apparently this isolated memory, like, must be an anomaly, and they like disregard it. But like the way I view the way I see like the idea that Tsvi is introducing here is, it's not that we want like reinvent our entire conceptual scheme from scratch. It's more like for example, evolution found some like inadequate equilibria that are like definitely almost certainly suboptimal like engineering solutions to particular problems, but because it's only moving, it only can like move on this like smooth fitness landscape. It can't like change many things at once, because if you change many things at once, then you get probably a dysfunctional organism. So for one example is that so there is one nerve that I think that descends to the chest, then wraps around the heart, and then comes back to innervate the pharynx. And this is definitely a suboptimal engineering solution, and it's like some atavism after fish that we have after fish, and it's especially like absurd in giraffes. And in giraffes, this nerve, actually, it goes across the entire through the entire neck, wraps around the heart, and then goes all the way back to innervate pharynx. And it seems like plausible to me that it would be, if not this example in particular, then something similar might be doable to re-engineer the genome such that this nerve actually like takes a more sensible route. But it will require like changing many genes at once or something like that, which evolution is capable of doing. So in a similar way, up until now, probably it seems like we only made progress in like revising our conceptual toolbox, like changing few concepts at a time. And we need to do something like genetic engineering, but on our concepts, in order to break out of current inadequate conceptual equilibrium and find a better one.
Tsvi?
Yeah, this is I agree with the summary. I mean, I would want to like refine things, like sort of taking the metaphor somewhat seriously, like evolution, like to be more precise, like evolution does change many things at once. Like if you have if you have variation at many loci, and fitness signals at each of those loci, then the allele frequencies for all those loci will be changing all at the same time. The thing that evolution can't do is propagate fitness signals where the signal is sort of like shaped so that it only like it's non-smooth, basically. Like like there's a fitness advantage to having all 4 of these alleles switched, but no fitness advantage or a fitness disadvantage to having 1, 2, or 3 of them switched. Like genetic engineering is sort of easier than this sort of like complex mechanism creation. Like you could do genetic engineering by just tweaking many independent alleles that have independent effects. But there's this more difficult thing where like there's the criterion of fitness, and this criterion of fitness sort of like in some sense would like this complex mechanism. It would upvote. It would reinforce an organism with all 5 of these alleles changed. But this criterion doesn't flow because 0 organisms have all 5 alleles. And similarly, or hopefully analogously, we have a criterion of we want a conceptual scheme which altogether as a conceptual scheme lets us do whatever, e.g. alignment. And this criterion fails to flow if the intermediate stages well if we're not making it flow, if we're not making the criterion flow through whatever intermediate stages we know how to access.
This is a bit of a wacky question, but does this suggest that there will be a temporary phase between us developing the conceptual tools we need to think about alignment and understand minds, and now there'll be some intermediate phase where we think some people have gone completely insane and we can't understand what they're talking about?
Could be. I don't necessarily want to pre-excuse that, but
yeah. Actually, maybe a more sensible version of that question is, do you think that there would be the possibility of communication between people on either side of this conceptual divide? Would we have enough overlap still? Or how domain specific is this kind of stuff that we need for alignment?
I didn't understand why the last part related, but to address the first part, well, I mean, we cross large conceptual distances all the time, and like in fact, I think like the way that we teach math, for example, is not the way that it was discovered. Like you discover math by a sequence of smaller steps. Probably this applies to whatever science and other stuff, but like you discover a group of people investigates, discovers, creates a field of math by making a whole lot of little steps, playing around with ideas and tweaking the concepts. When they like get to when they're hanging out in the region, they like refine and compile things and refactor things sort of away from the initial scheme. Like I don't think that like the modern definition of a manifold, of a Euclidean manifold, looks the same as like Poincaré's definition. I'm not 100% sure of that. Maybe he does have the. But sorry, I guess that there's lots of examples like this where the thing you read in the math textbook does not look like the thing that the original discoverers are saying. And this has some of this nature of like when you're refactoring this big code base of like the new theory, you're like doing some of this like let's make a big complex mechanism. Let's like create concepts that are useful in the context of this whole mechanism, even if they don't make sense at some previous intermediate stage.
Yep.
So crossing the gap from like a student who hasn't been exposed to this stuff at all to like the modern presentation of mathematical theories may be similar.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, we're out of time. Thank you so much, Tsvi, for that really interesting talk and for staying around to discuss it with us afterwards. I've really enjoyed it. So thanks a lot. And maybe we can all thank Tsvi in the chat before we leave.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Okay.
And thanks Giles for for coordinating and stuff.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Thank you. Really interesting to hear about your work. Okay, bye everyone.
Yeah, Gurgly. Yeah, thanks. Sorry, I don't know how to say your name, but yeah, thanks to you.